I became interested in particularly biomedical research as a child. Really, I had witnessed my grandmother go through a very troubling time with a brain tumor. It was very disruptive to our family, and after all hope was basically gone, the doctors said to my parents that there was nothing left to do except the possibility of some kind of research that might. My mother asked to hear more about that, and she ultimately decided that it would be an appropriate thing to do, that if it didn't help my grandmother, it might at least help someone else. And so they enrolled my grandmother in a clinical trial looking at a new hyperfractionated radiation therapy for deadly brain tumors. And the miraculous thing was that she woke up after that. She'd been in a coma for almost 3 months. And she woke up and she was able to actually talk to people. She was able to ask about her dog. She was able to regain her dignity for a period of time. And I said, wow, this is really something. And at that time, I didn't think anything about the ethical implications of doing research with human beings, even though that was the time when concurrently Henry Beecher was actually writing his incredibly important article on ethics in medical research. And so we didn't know what was going on at the time, but that set a foundation, sort of primed me for events that occurred many years later.
What was that time and where was that?
Well, I was growing up in a little town outside of Columbus, Ohio, called Westerville, Ohio. I was, a very active science student in the science fairs and all of that. This was back in the early 1960s. Actually, it was in 1963 that my grandmother died of her brain tumor ultimately. But I had been involved then, I have been involved in research involving human beings in an effort to bring science to help people for my entire life, really. I mean, from the time I was about 12 years old until the present time. I had been engaged in these science fair projects that actually involved doing studies of sleep with electrophysiologic recordings from my classmates. They volunteered as research subjects, and it was really my first research activity. In fact, it was even published. That goes back a long time, but I did not realize at the time we were doing all of this, I had no idea that I would ever end up being involved in particularly the area of research ethics and all, to the extent that I have been over the years. That was a later development. I'm sure you've known people who've grown up in Ohio before. Ohio is a place where they have somewhat conservative social values and all, where you grow up with these little stories playing in your mind. Any job worth doing is worth doing right. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. Do it right or don't do it at all. Those kinds of things. And so I grew up really influenced by my parents with a profound sense of fairness. That when you're going to, ask someone for something, when you're going to do something to someone, that you would naturally tell them what you're going to do, that you'd ask for their permission. I was influenced also by the physicians that, our family docs, Dr. Newland and all, who, set a model for how you interact in a compassionate, caring way, and yet an honest way with people. And so that really, I think, prepared me to be very receptive to the fact that if you're going to be doing science with human beings, that you had an obligation to them first. It just somehow came naturally. It was ingrained, and that's before I ever knew anything about the controversies. I certainly had, again, back in high school, read about the Holocaust. I read the history of Adolf Eichmann. I read about the horrors of the concentration camps and the so-called medical experiments that they did. And so I was aware of that. but not at all from a perspective of ethics. That's something that came much later. There was a wonderful man named Rudolf Kelbling, professor of psychiatry at the Ohio State University Medical Center, who saw the research work that I had done as a science fair project and actually invited me at the age of 15 to establish the first sleep laboratory at the Ohio State University Hospital, and others. I really had a blessed childhood. It was almost like living in Camelot. Not that, I mean, up until around 7th grade, I was so shy and socially awkward that, I didn't have friends. I think I had ADHD and found it often difficult for people to tolerate me because I was so active and all. But ultimately, that may have become an advantage. By the time I reached high school, I became much more open, engaging somehow, and made a huge number of friends. And my life just took off in a very positive way, so that, before I knew it, I was captain of the football team and president of the student body and president of the class and in the school plays and, going out with the homecoming queen, all of the things that you would envision as being a truly kind of a magical high school experience. And that gave me, I think, a sense of confidence in working with others that made it easier for me as I got to be a physician and also I think there were so many people involved at that time that I received so much positive feedback about the things that I was involved in and all that. It was very easy for me to just go out and do things. and so I did. It was interesting that my parents, we didn't have a lot. They had basically lost everything, including their business, while we were all still in school. But my father had a wonderful way about him where he would, you would ask for something and he'd say, well, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to do it, but if there's any way, we're going to try. And that's become part of my personality, as well. The expectation at the time was that I would, if anywhere, go to Ohio State. That seemed perfectly reasonable. But again, I'd received so much publicity, frankly, around the science projects and my football career and other things that I was contacted by the local representative to Congress and the senator to see if I would be interested in attending one of the service academies, and was ultimately appointed as the principal appointment to the Naval Academy, and was all set to go, signed, sealed, and delivered, ready to go for my physical and all to go to Annapolis. When my father happened to stop in he was a traveling salesman actually, he stopped in the Circleville Lumber Company one day and started talking to this fellow behind the desk named Pete Hart, who was the son of the owner. And naturally, fathers talked in glowing terms about their sons. And as he told Pete, about Greg, Pete said, "I'd like to meet this guy." And turns out Pete was the head of the Harvard Club of Central Ohio. Serendipity. Things just happen sometimes. It's almost as though they're fated. But the notion of going to Harvard, I didn't even know where Harvard was. I had no idea. And so I found myself suddenly invited to the annual Harvard Smoker at the Harvard Club of Central Ohio, along with several other, outstanding young people from the area. And we met with Fred Jewett, the dean, for admissions and all. And after the meeting, I got a letter from Mr. Jewett saying that we know that you could go anywhere you want to go, but we hope you'll come to Harvard, which was a pretty remarkable letter to get. And my parents were basically dumbstruck by the whole thing. I remember my father coming to a Harvard-Yale football game at one time, and it was just at the end of he just cried as he met the people. I can't believe this. I can't believe this ever happened. But it did happen, and so they were a big influence. But as I said, it mostly goes back to the fact they always told me, if you're going to do something, do it with all your heart. I was very involved in both my clinical work as an anesthesiologist and doing half-time research work, basically work on ion channels and receptors and work in the laboratory. But because I was both a scientist and a physician, I was invited to join the Subcommittee on Human Studies at the Mass General, which was the IRB. It was the committee that Henry Beecher himself had started and chaired, again, many years before that. By now, we're all the way up to the 1980s, so late 80s. I had joined the faculty there in 1984. So I didn't really want to do it. But again, it was sort of a responsibility. It was something that I should do, and so I did. And I went to a couple of meetings to get oriented, and was then assigned my first protocol to review. At that time, there wasn't a whole lot of training that went into preparing IRB members for their roles. But I remember reading through this protocol, and I was devastated. It was a protocol for a new blood substitute that potentially had promise, but the proposal, which would have been a phase 1 study, the first time this would be administered to a human being, was totally inadequate with respect to its design, the safety features. It was frightening. And I went into the meeting, the secondary reviewer, Ben Kazemi, a very distinguished transplant surgeon, was the primary reviewer. And I remember Dr. Kazemi going through a scathing review of this protocol before he literally threw it, up into the center of the table, and he said, "You might do this in a Nazi concentration camp, but we're not going to do it at the Mass General." And with that, I was relieved because I said I agreed completely, and of course I said so. But what troubled me most was that this protocol was from my own colleagues in the departments of cardiac surgery and cardiac anesthesia. Interesting that I'd be invited to review a protocol by my own colleagues. Things have changed since then, but I was so devastated by this and the review that we just heard by Dr. Kazemi that I literally walked to the office of my chief, Dr. Kitts, and his secretary said, "I'm sorry, he's with someone." I said, "I don't care." And I opened the door and went in, and he looked up startled. Yeah. And I put the protocol on his desk, and I said, "Did you read this?" And, he looked at it and said, "Well, I signed it." And I said, "Yeah, you signed it, but did you read it?" He said, "Well, no, I didn't." I said, "It's devastating." And I went through the story. And I said, "This is just unacceptable. This used to be, your predecessor was Henry Beecher. We have an obligation." I was totally out of control. But that he got it, and the passion that I expressed there, he ultimately didn't argue. He simply said, "Well, what do we need to do?" And so I told him how we needed to fix this, how we needed to train investigators, we needed, all went through the whole litany. And he said, "Okay, you do it." And so I began working within the department to develop ways to train investigators, help them put together protocols, consent forms, and so on. Before you know it, I developed a reputation within our own committee for having a knack for doing this, understanding the complexities, and finding solutions, which was very important. And it just, again, came kind of naturally to me. Apart from the fact that it was ingrained in my being from childhood, that you do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, I'd never thought about ethics as a discipline, or even as a practice, if you will, applied ethics. And it was all very new. And it wasn't until I was given the materials to read by Roz Gray, who was running the IRB, still is today, and all, that I first read Beecher's work. And I first read the statement of principles, ethical principles for the conduct of human research that the Mass General had established, that I read the Nuremberg Code, that I read Jay Catt's book. I got so enthralled, I opened Jay Catt's book, and it's this thick. And I basically sat down. It was bedtime reading. It felt right somehow. Yeah.
When you started your involvement with the IRB, what was the IRB like at that point?
Pretty much exactly as it is today. 25 people concerned, sitting around the room, reviewing protocols, with two primary reviewers and the rest looking in. I don't think it's changed much at all, frankly, although the emphasis may have changed a bit because of the increased procedural requirements that have come. At the time that I first became involved with the IRB, it was before the Common Rule was actually passed. And so it was, this goes back quite a way. So there have been a number of changes over the years, and I guess some of those I bear some responsibility for. The notion that IRB members are doing a specialized function that requires specialized training and all has been one of the major developments over the last 30 years. And of course, Primer has played a very important role in that, in educating not only IRB members, but other members of the research community as to what their responsibilities are. And everyone's come to realize, as Mike Groden, who was one of my teachers in all of this, actually Mike was my senior resident when I was a pediatrics intern, so he had a great influence on me. But Mike always said that ethical issues are tough because they're tough. There's no such thing as an easy ethical dilemma. And I developed a great appreciation for that, and so I understood the importance of trying to focus the issues in a way, develop a process for resolving ethical issues. And I think that now is more ingrained in the process. I think the notion of sharing responsibilities between the research team and the IRB is one that is present today that wasn't, frankly, so present 30 years ago. I ended up moving from being a member to the IRB to the chair of the IRB to being director of human research affairs, first for the MGH and then for partners. And as I did that, we gained greater visibility, both locally and nationally, with respect to the IRB process. From the beginning, again, going back to my personal roots and values, I always had the sense that when you have shared goals and shared responsibilities, you can work together to find solutions. And I was tasked when Partners Healthcare System was formed with bringing the Brigham and Women's Hospital and the Mass General Hospital together in an integrated system, and for human subjects protection and ethical review. And it seemed to me that the way to overcome the divide, which was substantial between these two institutions, was to take this shared goals, shared responsibilities approach. And so we did, and that became the byline for how we were going to get to this new environment. And it was well received by the entire research community. And what we were doing, I think, both in terms of the approaches and the system, the actual using systems approaches to get work done more efficiently but with high quality, caught the attention of a number of people, in particular the Office of the Inspector General. Shortly in the time frame around the death of Jesse Gelsinger and other activities that led up to the creation of the Office for Human Research Protections. And it turns out that Mark Yeshin, he was the principal for the studies that the Office of the Inspector General did looking at the IRB system in the United States. had heard about our work, and I remember one day I got a call from the Inspector General's office saying, "We'd like to talk to you." And I thought, ooh, this doesn't sound good. But Mark came, and he met with me and Ron Neubauer, who was the Vice President for Research Management at the time. And we told him about the problems that we were trying to address. We told him about the solutions that we were working on and how it was being received. And strangely enough, virtually everything that we were doing at Partners at the time and the recommendations somehow became incorporated into the recommendations within the Inspector General's report. And when Secretary Shalala, when the committee that she put together decided that they should create a new office for protection of human subjects, move it out of NIH and move it to the Office of the Secretary, they created a job description that many said looked strangely familiar in terms of what we were doing, at Partners and so on. And in fact, I had no intention of applying for that job, but I began to receive emails and calls from colleagues, around the country saying, "You ought to do this." And so I did ultimately submit an application for the position, and when I went down to interview with at that time the Surgeon General David Satcher and the staff, I hadn't met with Secretary Shalala yet. The program that we talked about was basically exactly what they wanted to have done. So it was almost a match that was somehow set up, and in fact, some people in Congress thought that it was. I ended up being investigated for that while I was the director of OHRP. But there was nothing, there was no foul play whatsoever. It was just, a set of, as Secretary Shalala said, sort of the right person, right ideas, the right time. And so that's kind of explains how I got from the Mass General down to Washington as well.
Can you describe an example of an ethical dilemma that came in front of the IRB that may have been handled differently later in your tenure than it would have been before you came on board?
Oh, there's so many, but one that comes to mind was a protocol regarding autism. Autism can be a very devastating condition, and we certainly know more about it today than we used to, and that's in part because we're now doing research with people who suffer from autism. If you go back 20 years ago, they weren't doing research with people suffering from autism because somehow there was a notion that these people were too vulnerable, that they were inappropriate as research subjects, particularly to take someone with autism and put them into a PET scanner or functional MRI and expect them to lay there while they study their brain and ask them questions and so on. But a protocol came through that wanted to do just that. And it led to a very lengthy and emotional discussion among the entire committee. And when after we completed the discussion, it was clear that we didn't know enough about autism to really make a determination as to whether or not it was an appropriate way to do research, or even if it was appropriate to do research in this population. And so the solution was to appoint a working group of the IRB members, including both lay and scientific members, and have them meet with a group that was put together by the local group that was an advocacy group for patients with autism. And they brought along, I remember the meeting well, a gentleman who had suffered with autism from childhood and yet now was a functioning adult, was able to get by, learned to deal with his disease. And we learned so much. We learned that, in fact, even when people have autism, they can still make rational decisions. We were totally ignorant. And as a result of this meeting that we put together, again, two groups who were at odds with common goals and common responsibilities that were shared, we actually found a way to do this research that otherwise it might have just not happened. And it was valuable research, and it's led to our understanding of autism. It also educated a whole group of us around the IRB and others about the value of looking beyond just what you know in order to get more information, a different perspective on the issues as a means of resolving these ethical dilemmas. And we applied that approach to many other protocols, protocols involving children, protocols involving phase 1 studies and others. Even I remember one after the death of Jesse Gelsinger. We were doing a protocol at the Mass General that involved, again, brain tumors, something that I had known something about. And it was a phase 1 protocol using a gene transfer approach to put the susceptibility for a certain antibiotic selectively into tumor cells. And the virus that was being used for the gene transfer was the same virus that had been involved in the study in which Jesse Gelsinger died. And I got a call from Alice Dember at the Boston Globe. She'd found out that we were doing this study, and she wanted to know if the Mass General was going to stop this study. And I, in fact, told her no, we weren't. And she said, why not? And I said, because we're doing it right. Because we had taken the time to do it right, and we felt good about that. So I think at the Mass General, there's always been, I think, a strong commitment from the time of Henry Beecher to doing it right. And that doesn't mean just not doing it. That means looking, learning, finding the way to do it right. And I'm very, very proud to have been part of that. Over the time that I moved from member to chair to director of human research affairs, we developed a system that truly earned the respect and the appreciation of the scientists themselves. When I went to go to Washington, to leave to go to Washington, the most gratifying thing, perhaps, or one of the most in my life, was that it was the scientists from the Mass General who came to me and said, we're really going to miss you because what you've done has helped us, it's helped our patients and so on. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we have today, frankly. I'm maybe jumping ahead, but I might as well go ahead and say it. The IRB process today has, to a very large extent, lost the respect of the scientific community. It's even lost the respect of many in the IRB community itself because it's become so focused on regulatory requirements and procedures that it's I believe lost its way. It's lost its true underpinnings as a fundamental ethical review, and it's become more of a procedural review. And today, I know from my own research, because I'm still doing research, that hours and hours are literally wasted dealing with minutia that really has no part in the IRB process. And it's unfortunate, and that's one of the driving forces, of course, behind the current push for revisions of the process. I think that we are in a different place today than we were 40 years ago when all of this really started. At that time, we were reeling from one scandal after another. We had not only the horrors of, the Second World War, but the abuses that Beecher had written about in his article and others. And so as many have said before me, the system that we have is fundamentally based in protectionism. And I don't believe that scientists are bad people who want to hurt, the patients and all, that they're dedicated to trying to help. I reject that as a notion. I think that today there's a much greater willingness among physician investigators, and I'm talking primarily about, in this case, the biomedical sciences, although you can translate some of this to the social and behavioral sciences as well. But it seems to me that as we have matured and gained greater knowledge and all this, we should have been working toward improving a system to recognize that and move much more toward a system that's based on professionalism, as we have in every other aspect of medicine. than to continue to rely on a truly regulation-based, compliance-focused, process-oriented activity. That it's not clear to me that it is adding to the process the value that we had hoped that it would.
What would you envision?
I would actually envision an application of the processes that we currently use throughout medicine to support professionalism. In medicine, if one is going to practice in a given specialty, I'm a cardiac anesthesiologist. Before I'm allowed to do anesthesia for people having heart surgery, I'm required to go to college, get into medical school, complete medical school satisfactorily, take my national board examinations, get into an accredited residency program, ultimately do a fellowship. I have to pass additional board examinations, within my specialty, and even after I've met all of those requirements, before I'm allowed to practice, I have to go to my institution and seek privileges in order to do it. What's required of someone who wants to be a clinical investigator? Nothing. Nothing. There's an assumption somehow that even today that people will be able to be a responsible clinical investigator because they went to medical school or whatever reason. It's not fair to say nothing. I mean, today we expect investigators to take an ethics module through the NIH that a layperson can take and become a certified investigator in about 7 minutes. We know that because critics of the process have done that. We now expect people to take the city course, for instance, at most institutions across the country. The CITI program is certainly, it's a good step forward, but I don't think that it goes far enough at all. I think if we truly want to have a professional environment that incorporates the kinds of values that we expect of physicians as professionals and others, then we need to build that into the system. And I mean, it's not going to solve all the problems, but I think that if we were to do that, we would find that it would be much easier to have physician investigators who would take a greater personal responsibility for not just the scientific part of the protocol, but for the ethical dimensions of the protocol as well. I find it almost impossible to believe that we have never required investigators to, until relatively recently, we see it changing now, but over the years we've not required investigators to discuss the ethical dimensions of their work, to discuss the options that they considered in order, when they designed the protocol, in order to address those ethical challenges. Why this model as opposed to another model? Instead of that, we've created a system where the investigator tries to design a protocol that will get through the IRB. I think that's wrong thinking. It's the wrong orientation. And if we can change that, then I think we will, truly move toward a new place that we'll all benefit from.
Do you think today that there's support for that kind of restructuring of the system?
Well, there's certainly support for restructuring. Just how it's going to occur is as yet very unclear. As you know, in the recent years, both the Office of Management and Budget and OHRP itself have come together with their in our what they call the notice of advance notice, the ANPRM, the advance notice of proposed rulemaking. I didn't know there was such a thing when I was in Washington, but they created it for this. And there's clearly a desire, a recognition of the need to change the current process. But I don't think it can be done within the current framework. And so if we're going to truly move to a different model, fundamentally different model, I think we need to change from this paradigm of protectionism to a paradigm of professionalism. And I think there's really growing acceptance of that we're seeing not only, primarily actually at this point within industry, a recognition of the fact that a well-trained investigator, in fact, not only does better science, but they provide the greatest protections for the human research participants. Well, Henry Beecher said that 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So I think that we may be at the point that we've matured enough to again move beyond this model where we have to have someone watching all the time, slapping your hands if you do something wrong, doing the mother may I routine. I think that's in a sense degrading to science, and I think we really do need to move forward.
I'd like to go back to the Office for Human Research Protections. I know that when you were appointed, it was a significant point in time because the OHRP shifted from being part of the National Institutes of Health to being part of the Department of Health and Human Services, and that the name was also changed from the Office of Protection from Research Risk to the Office of Human Research Protections. Can you explain why the shift was made from NIH to HHS?
At that particular time, the OPRR, under the leadership of Gary Ellis, felt that its office had essentially lost its impact, that it was spending virtually all of its resources going through negotiations of these paper agreements called assurances, and not doing anything that was meaningfully involved with protection of human subjects. And so as I understand it, the staff at OPRR, all of whom I knew, in fact, from our interactions with them, decided that they should actually go to look at some of the institutions who had made assurances to see whether or not those assurances, the terms of the assurances, were actually being followed. Well, that's a rather novel idea for government, to actually look to see whether or not what they're doing is doing what it's supposed to do. And when they did that, of course, what they found wasn't particularly pretty. So that major institutions, like Duke and Rush Presbyterian and a host of others, discovered that in fact they were not conducting their activities in a manner that was consistent with the promise that they had made. That's what an assurance is. It's a promise that you're going to do things in a certain way, meet certain goals. They weren't doing it. And so when OPRR decided that if they weren't doing it, they weren't meeting the terms of their assurance, then why should NIH meet the terms of their agreement, which was to give them research funding? They ended up with what they called the shutdowns, and while some said this was like using a nuclear bomb, unnecessarily for a minor conflict, in fact it awakened the entire world to the fact that there was a serious responsibility if you're going to be doing research with human beings, and that you have an obligation that has to be fulfilled. And so that was a backdrop under which Harold Varmus, who was then the director of NIH, and Secretary Shalala said, let's look at this. And they composed they put together a committee of people from all different areas that looked at this process, say, is OHRP or OPRR under the thumb of the people who are funding research? Is it appropriate to have the oversight agency housed in a subordinate position within the funding agency? And everyone who looked at it agreed that that's not an optimal arrangement. And so it was that report made recommendations that the office be moved, that animals and humans could in fact be separated, because OPRR dealt with animal research as well. And so they felt that there should be a separation, both in terms of responsibilities for human research on the one hand, animals on the other, although many would argue that the system put in place for animals was in fact better at the time than what was in place for humans. They had accreditation of animal programs and everything else. That's a little aside that we can talk about later. But particularly Secretary Shalala and Harold Varmus felt strongly that the office needed to be positioned in such a way that it would be more visible, that it would have respect, and it would not be subordinated or even have the appearance of subordination and potential conflict of interest with the other agencies. So Secretary Shalala moved it to the Office of the Secretary and made a commitment to ensuring that it would have the necessary resources to be able to do its job without interference. And that was a milestone change in the whole history of this particular endeavor.
And the change in name was to signify this change?
Well, it was to emphasize the fact that it was beyond just protection from research risks, that it focused on human beings. An interesting perspective on this, actually, though, the name came from my daughter, who at the time that I went off to OHRP was, in her last 2 years of high school, very smart young woman, and she looked at the name of the office and observed that in fact what it says, the office is to protect human research. It's not protection of human research subjects. Read it. It's literal. It's the Office for Human Research Protection. Okay? Because that's what the office should be doing. And I used that line throughout, my presentations the entire time that I was there, because it's not so much about protection of human research subjects. It's about protecting human research, because if you don't do it right, people are not going to let us do it at all. So I think that's an interesting thing that it probably takes someone like my daughter looking at it from afar to actually make that observation. The move, it created exactly what they hoped for: visibility, stature, a sense of crisis, which is absolutely essential if you expect to affect change. It provided an opportunity to deliver a new message. And from day one, in fact, even before I started, we set the tone for what we wanted to do in a conference at the National Institutes of Health, where they had the FDA and they had the director of NIH and all of the luminaries from all over at this meeting, and it was focused on compliance. And I was asked, even though I'd been appointed, but I wasn't going to start until later on, I was asked to give the concluding remarks, pull it all together. And I had listened to Ruth Kirchstein and the FDA commissioner and others say, what we need is a culture of compliance. What we need is a culture of compliance. And, when I remember as I was composing my remarks the night before, I simply rejected that. It rang completely wrong to me. And so when I got up there to make my remarks, I actually apologized to the director of NIH and to the FDA commissioner and others who were there, and said, I know what you intended, but we do not need a culture of compliance. Okay? What we need to establish is a culture of conscience in which people do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And of course that became, again, the motto. And I suppose now, looking back on it, it's one of the things that I find most gratifying is that so many of my colleagues and those that I've met, who came much later, not just who were there at the time, but that notion of working to establish a culture of conscience it's still prevalent, it's still there, and if we can find the way to actually achieve that, then I think we will have really finally accomplished what we need to do.
What were your specific goals as you came on board?
Well, I wanted to ensure that we, first of all, got this clearly across to everyone, the fact that we had to work together on this, that it was an issue of shared goals and shared responsibilities. And that was going to require major change, particularly with respect to investigators, because they were going to have to better understand what their responsibilities were. It was going to require a greater effort on behalf of the administration and the leadership at institutions and all that to understand that their assurances were not just pieces of paper, that they were commitments that had to be fulfilled. It was going to require new education, both for investigators and members of the IRBs, as well as research participants. People who would be the subjects of research needed to understand the process, and we needed to ensure that we had a system that took advantage, where possible, of better technology, simplified policies and procedures. We wanted to streamline things in order to use our limited resources more wisely. So we designed the office to be able to do those things. We actually we created the federal-wide assurance, which instead of having, believe it or not, prior to OHRP, every agreement between the government and an institution was individually crafted and negotiated. Okay, that's for hundreds, thousands of institutions, both in the U.S. and abroad. That consumed 70% of the resources of OPRR. So that's wrong. We need to be redirecting those resources. And why do we need to do it different every time? They all come out to be basically the same. Let's just have a standard assurance, and we'll use it for everybody. Okay, because all it is a simple promise. If we're going to do research, take the money, we're going to do it right. And that means we're going to do these things. And so we did that. And it wasn't easy to do, but we did that.
What were the challenges to doing
that?
Well,
the challenge was that in order to, because of the so-called common rule, OHRP was at HHS, of course, as was the FDA and the NIH and others. But the common rule, in fact, had been adopted and incorporated into the individual codes for more than 20 federal agencies. So there's the Department of Education, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Environmental Protection, all of these. They all had incorporated this, but none of them were completely happy, with all of the provisions. And so it took Joan Porter, who actually managed to get this done, years and years and years. We've written about it. I'm sure you'll be interviewing Joan on this. It was very, very difficult. And so because she had to work all these compromises through the multiple agencies, anytime that anything would be done that might change anything relevant to all of these agencies was automatically going to meet with resistance. But we were very fortunate. In addition to being the head of OHRP, I also chaired the federal-wide Committee on Human Research Protections, which actually was based at the White House through the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And we used that body, I think, very effectively to explain to all of the agencies what we were doing and what it was all about. It was a challenging process, but it was ultimately done. And I think for the most part, it's worked reasonably well, although it's had some unforeseen consequences that have been unfortunate as well.
Such as?
Such as. Prior to the federal-wide assurance, most of the major academic institutions simply agreed, as a matter of principle, to apply all provisions of the HHS regulations, which included the multiple subparts of that regulation, to all of the research that was done at the institution, no matter who it came under. Now, that's a sensible position. If you're going to do research with human beings, you do it the same way for all of it, right? But in order to be able to get this new federal-wide assurance through the multiple agencies that were there, it was necessary to provide an option for them not to do that, so that if you were at the Department of Education, you didn't have to apply the HHS regulations because they didn't think that they were directly applicable. Similarly, for an institution, they were concerned that if they'd made an assurance that OHRP were to restrict in some way, then it would impact all of their research rather than just the research that that was funded by the government or supported by the government in some way. And to me it's really heartbreaking and almost disgusting, frankly, that institutions would, what the nomenclature today is, uncheck the box and say, no, we're going to limit the application of these principles and regulations to only NIH-funded or supported research. So we're going to exclude FDA research. We're going to exclude independently funded research. That, to me, is very unfortunate, unexpected development that came, from this process. And it's one of the things that, frankly, needs to be addressed today. We need to have a uniform system in which we recognize that all research that's going to be done with human beings should be done right, and in accordance with the principles as well as the appropriate regulatory requirements. And so we'll just have to see what transpires. It was an interesting first day in Washington. I had accepted the position after actually meeting with Secretary Shalala and sort of getting a commitment. When I went to Washington, my first day, I arrived at the airport and opened the paper, and on the second page under national news was a headline in the Washington Post about, new director faces issues or some such thing. And it sort of set a bad tone for the day, because as I went to meet the director of NIH, the paper was open to that page and said, that's interesting. And so same thing at the FDA and the other places I met. So when I finally met with Secretary Shalala in the afternoon, I first was to meet with the press corps. So I walked in, and they were all there. And of course, everyone who saw the thing, I'd walk into the office and they'd say, "Welcome to Washington." Well, I walked in with Secretary's press corps at HHS, and they opened the paper there and said, "Welcome to Washington," and I just lost it. I said, "That story is wrong, it's fabricated," and everything else. I said, "I want it fixed. I want it fixed today, or I'll be out of here."
What was the story?
Oh, it was a story that
Just in a nutshell?
it had to do with a study that had been done by the Harvard School of Public Health in China, and there were issues that had been raised. In fact, the MGH, I had nothing to do with it whatsoever. There, in fact, had been quotes fabricated and so on. So it was as though the story had been planted in order to make life difficult. But the bottom line was, the head of the press team said, settle down here, big boys. And, the last thing you want to do on day one is to pick a fight with the Washington Post. They said, clearly you've made an impression, because if this were inconsequential, they wouldn't be doing anything about it, right? So this is a compliment. Get used to it. And so I then went in, I settled down and walked in to meet with the secretary. And she, of course, had the paper over on her desk, and she said, "Welcome to Washington." I said, "Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. I look forward to working with you." And she winked, and she said, "So is there anything else that you want to tell me?" I said, "There's nothing to tell you except what we've already talked about." But I said, "I will tell you that I'm distressed by this. And you need to know that I'm committed to doing this right, and I need your 100% support if we're going to do it. And if I don't get that, okay, I'm going to walk right back to to Boston." But I said the way home passes through the offices of the Washington Post. Okay, so there can't be interference. We need to do this and do it right. And she said, "That's absolutely fine." She said, "That's what we brought you down here for." And that was the way it worked at the full time while Secretary Shalala was in place. It was a little more challenging when the administrations changed unexpectedly, when Al Gore lost and we had President Bush in the office. Anyone who's lived through a change of administration in Washington, particularly when there's a change of party, they understand that it's a complicated time, and so there were additional complications there. But still, at no time was there any interference whatsoever in the mandate of what we were supposed to do, and I think that that's almost remarkable. That's Washington's a pretty political place, but apart from these silly congressional investigations that I told you about, that was it. The broader acceptance by the entire research community of the importance of ensuring that we do research in a responsible and ethical manner. It was the most rewarding aspect of that. And I can also say that the most disheartening aspect of all of this, too, is that now 10 years later, so much of what we had worked so hard to accomplish has in many ways reverted back to a system that has again become mired in the focus on regulation and compliance rather than the goal. So it's as though we did, a whole step forward and then have migrated back. If you ever saw the movie Awakenings, where they had the people who Robin Williams was the doctor, and they had people who had basically gone into catatonic states, and they were sitting there, and he gave them a medicine, and then they all woke up and they started moving around and living their lives again, and then eventually they all returned to their previous state. Sometimes I have nightmares that we've done that in human research, which is why I've taken a very vocal, frankly, position that we need to do more than simply tinker with the existing system. We need to fundamentally change the paradigm, as I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm. How did you decide to leave in 2002?
Very easy. It was almost 2003. When I went to Washington, I made it clear to Secretary Shalala that I was committing to only 2 years because I'd made the same commitment to my lovely wife, Linda. And I had 3 children at home who were all in high school, who expected to have Daddy around. I did get home for the soccer games and the school plays and all of those other things that are so important to children growing up. But for 3 years, better part, I was there for almost 3 years. I was, at least for much of the week, a father in absentia. And I had, I remember when Linda and I had talked about my going, it was the night before I actually had to tell Secretary Shalala of my decision. And we were at the Association of Clinical Research Professionals meeting in New Orleans. She went with me, which is something she never did. But I remember Colin Powell gave the keynote address at this meeting. And we went out for dinner that night, and we were going to talk about whether or not I would take this job. And we had a lovely dinner. We did everything except talk about whether or not I was going to go to Washington. And finally, I said, honey, this has been a great evening, but I said, we really need to talk about this. And she said, Greg, there's nothing to talk about. I said, what do you mean? It's the biggest decision we've made in our marriage, apart from having children. And she said, I know that I have no choice in this whatsoever. Okay? But she said, I also know that you have no choice in this whatsoever. You have to go, you have to do this. I will keep things going at home. We will get by. Okay? You have to go and do this. Remember, when you're done, it's my turn. I said, that sounds pretty good. And so I'd made a commitment to Linda. It turns out I stayed for almost 9 months longer because we had commissioned a project with the Institute of Medicine around accreditation. Initially, they did 2 reports for us. The first one, where they actually recommended accreditation be tried. I was a very strong advocate for it because I thought that would be a way to much more effectively achieve standards and performance at IRBs everywhere without having to use a government regulatory agency to do it. Use third-party neutral accreditation instead. And that's very similar, of course, to what we're doing in my current endeavor, ACRES, where we're building standards for accreditation of clinical research sites globally. There's power behind these tools. But we knew when the second report was going out, and the second report was actually an evaluation of the things that we had implemented from year 1, year 2, so on, to see whether or not they were having an impact. And that's it. And I figured when that report came out, there would be only 2 courses of action. Okay, one would be to that they would say we had really screwed up, in all that we were doing, we'd gone the wrong direction, and in which case I would have to leave Washington. Or they could say we were doing all the right things and all that, and if they did, that things were working, we need to continue, then I could also leave Washington. So the report came out. It was quite favorable. It again said that, I mean, there were still things to do, but they said that we were on the right track, and so I wrote a letter to the secretary. I thanked for the opportunity, summarized, what we were doing and what still needed to be done, and I went home to my wife and family. That was easy to do.
What did you do when you came back to Boston?
Did my best to stay out of the way. In fact, I remember it was a painful thing, but I sort of, in the morning, said, "Well, honey, I'm home." She said, "I know that." She said, "Do me a favor." She said, "Just please stay out of the way, okay? Because, Greg, I don't mean to hurt you, but I've had to learn how to get by on my own for 3 years, okay? I've learned to get by without your being here, okay? And it's going to take me a while to learn again, how to build you back into this family." And so that was hard. It was quite hard. But I, of course, returned to the Mass General. Mm-hmm. I had to retool, get back up to speed with my clinical activities, because that was somewhat like riding a bike. It takes a little bit just to get comfortable with it, but then it comes back very quickly. But I realized that the IRBs were only one very small piece of the overall clinical research enterprise, and that if we really wanted to achieve our long-term goals of having clinical research done in a responsible, ethical manner, that would be safe and efficient and effective, that we needed to include more than the IRBs. We needed to get the investigators, the coordinators, the monitors, the sponsors, patients. We needed to get everybody engaged in this process. And so I began work with several of the professional organizations that I had worked with. I continued to work with Primer. I worked with ACRP and all toward creating a program for certification of clinical investigators. Became involved with multiple organizations, around the world. And that set the stage for what has ultimately become my current ongoing passion, and will be the last thing that I do professionally, and that is to build a global alliance of like-minded organizations and people who believe, as I said, that research is good, but that it needs to be done responsibly, it needs to be done right, and that we can achieve enormous increases in quality, safety, and efficiency if we simply work together to build a system that incorporates, that aligns ethical principles with good business practices, so that we give a mechanism to do the right thing, because it's the right thing to do in a way that's beneficial to all of the stakeholders. And that sounds like a win-win opportunity, and it's turning out to be that. In fact, the Alliance for Clinical Research Excellence and Safety, which this is not a promotional activity, because this is a nonprofit, organization. They're working, and these goals are moving forward with rapidly growing and almost passionate acceptance by many across the entire industry. And part of what we're doing is focused on global ethical and regulatory innovation, so that we can use the multi-stakeholder group in order to actually catalyze the kinds of changes that we were talking about earlier that need to be done, changing the whole paradigm. Because frankly, we can't afford to have an important protocol that could potentially bring a new medicine, to solve an important problem, tied up in an inefficient, unprofessional kind of review process for months, and it often happens that way. So if we're going to have a more efficient, more effective system, then the ethical review process and the other supporting processes need to be designed to be compatible with that. And so we're doing it, and it's very exciting, exciting stuff.
You have a lot of passions. But what would you say touches you most deeply about what you do?
I think back to my grandmother And I think back to, all of the patients and all who have come to this research endeavor with, such hope. And I don't think that's a conflict of interest. I think that that having hope that science can deliver things to help people of the world in terms of the quality of their lives, their happiness, their productivity, their health, that's a noble cause. And if we can contribute to making that happen in a way that will try to be more fair, safer, then I think that's something that we can really be proud of. And so that's what drives me, to do this every day. It goes back to the very first thing that I wanted to do when I first decided, after this episode with my grandmother when I was only 11 years old, that this is what I wanted to do, and I'm still doing it. There is one important event that I haven't talked about that maybe I will. Most of the people who attended the Primer conference, actually, just as I stepped down from OHRP, will remember it very well, because I told the story about how my son drowned in a swimming pool due to my own irresponsibility. And it was it sort of in keeping with my childhood. I said, was a blessed existence. In this particular devastating, circumstance, I also found myself blessed in that the skills that I had learned as a physician, the knowledge that I'd learned as an investigator, came in very handy. Because although my son had drowned in the pool, I was able to do single-handed CPR for 14 minutes. I was able to care for him at a little community hospital in Lake Saranac, New York, and he recovered completely, recovered just fine. And it was that weekend, after this extraordinary experience, that I realized that I was going to be much better able to make a difference, to try and bring the benefits of science to the people of the world, not by moving those little tissue culture dishes around an incubator and studying ion channels, but to take what I'd learned about building systems to do these important jobs in a responsible and efficient way, apply that to this entire clinical research process. It was that event specifically that made me give up my laboratory and instead turn so much more of my attention to the IRB, and ultimately led down this pathway that I never expected to follow, that took me from the IRB to partners to Washington and now to the world. And I'm continually reminded when I think about investigators who've been caught in a situation such as the investigators at the University of Rochester, where the young woman died after an overdose of lidocaine. They didn't want to hurt her, or the death of Ellen Roche at Hopkins, or Jesse Gelsinger. These weren't people who wanted to hurt anyone. And it's so easy in this world to, have a moment of irresponsibility affect you in some way, and the lives of others in some way that you could never have anticipated. You might never, ever have wanted it to happen. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that's what happened at the time. And if we can learn from those experiences and find a way to use that energy that could just be wasted as remorse and all, and channel it in a more constructive way, that will be good for everyone. So maybe I'm just dealing with my own guilt that way, that's fine. It's constructive. So I think it's a good thing to do. I've obviously had a very interesting journey over these last many years, but boy, there have been an awful lot of people who've been walking right alongside the trail and helped with so many things along the way. People are just willing to contribute their time and effort and all. And many of those people I've met through Primer and other organizations that I've worked with, and it's just so enriched my own life personally to have so many friends, and of course what they say about friends, you've got to use them or lose them. And so all of those friendships and relationships that we built during these various activities over the years are now something that we're able to leverage the value of with respect to what we're doing in Acres. And so what comes around goes around, or whatever they say. And so this is an exciting time. I think we've got a few good years left to accomplish some more before we finally hang it up and sail off to the horizon. If only we could build this global system for clinical research. It's really all about promoting clinical research excellence and safety. If this initiative that we're engaged in today can truly be realized and implemented in an effective way globally, it will benefit the entire world, and that would be my hope.